Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a journey back, way back to the dawn of civilization itself, to ancient Sumer. Forget dusty textbooks and dry legal codes because tonight we're diving into the surprisingly funny, incredibly human, and occasionally downright bizarre world of their ancient Sumerian laws. You're about to discover that even 4,000 years ago, people were getting into the kind of ridiculous scrapes that would make for a great sitcom today. You probably won't survive this deep dive without a few chuckles, so consider yourself warned. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, like and follow the channel to keep waiting for the next exciting parts. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with the Code of Ur-Nammu, generally considered the oldest known law code in the world, predating even Hammurabi by several centuries. Imagine, if you will, the bustling city-states of Sumer around 2100 BCE, with their towering ziggurats, their bustling markets, and their complex irrigation systems. Amidst all this innovation, they invented riding the wheel and even beer. They also decided, hey, maybe we should write down some rules so people stop, hitting each other with hoes. And thus law was born, often with a surprisingly gentle touch for its era. A mainstream historical fact about the Code of Ur-Nammu is that it's not based on the eye for an eye principle, which became famous later with Hammurabi's code. Instead, it favored monetary compensation for injuries. So if someone, say, accidentally stepped on your foot and broke a bone, they wouldn't get their own foot broken in retaliation. Nope. They just have to pay you a certain amount of silver, which frankly sounds a lot more reasonable than a trip to the ancient Sumerian emergency room followed by mandatory retaliation. Now, this emphasis on fines over physical retribution gave the laws a unique flavor, sometimes bordering on the absurd, especially when you consider the sheer specificity. You see, the Sumerians were nothing if not meticulous. So while other early societies might have simply said, "Don't injure people," the Sumerians laid out exactly what specific body part was worth what amount of silver. It's like having a price list for every bone in your body, just in case someone gets a little too enthusiastic during a casual chat. One quirky tidbit from the Code of Ur-Nammu, or rather the fragments we have, is its surprising concern for the vulnerable in society. Ur-Nammu, the king, boasted that he ensured the orphan did not become the victim of the wealthy, the widow did not become the victim of the powerful, the man of one shekel did not become the victim of the man of one mina. This dedication to justice, even for the less powerful, shows a remarkable foresight. Of course, historians still argue whether these were genuine societal protections or simply shrewd propaganda from the king. Either way, it suggests a legal system that at its core sought a kind of balance, even if that balance sometimes tipped into the comically specific. So picture this: you're a Sumerian citizen happily tending your barley field, and suddenly a rogue ox from your neighbor's farm comes stomping through, flattening your prize crop. In many places, this might escalate into a full-blown argument, maybe even a brawl involving some of those aforementioned hoes. But in Sumer, you'd simply consult the Code of Ur-Nammu, calculate the damages, and present your neighbor with a bill. It takes all the fun out of a good neighborly feud, really, but it certainly makes for a more orderly society. This foundational principle of compensation, while seemingly progressive, also meant that literally everything had a price tag, from a broken limb to a ruined fence. Get ready to explore a legal system where every unfortunate incident had a specific, often oddly precise monetary value. So you've grasped that Sumerian law, particularly under Ur-Nammu, leaned heavily on fines rather than literal retribution. This applied to a surprising range of everyday mishaps, making life in ancient Mesopotamia a constant negotiation of monetary value for everything from bodily harm to stray farm animals. You might think, how complicated could a runaway ox really be? Ah, my friend, you underestimate the meticulousness of the Sumerian legal mind. Let's talk about those oxen. If your ox or a donkey or even a particularly spirited goat decided to stage a jailbreak from its pen and in its newfound freedom trampled through your neighbor's pristine barley field, the law had very specific stipulations. It wasn't just pay for damages. Oh no. It depended on the extent of the damage, and crucially whether your animal was known to be a repeat offender. If it was a first-time escapade, you'd pay one amount. If this was Ferdinand the Bull's third rodeo pun, absolutely intended through someone's crops, the fine might be higher, acknowledging your lax pen maintenance. Imagine the court transcripts. Your Honor, this is the third time Mr. Enlil-Bani's ox has wreaked havoc on my irrigation ditches. I demand compensation for lost yield and emotional distress. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of these animal-related laws suggests a particularly unruly livestock population or simply the immense economic importance of agriculture in Sumerian society. And it wasn't just runaway animals causing trouble. What about the very structures of Sumerian life? Their houses were often made of mud brick, and while sturdy, they weren't immune to the occasional structural integrity issue. This brings us to collapsing walls. Now you'd think if your wall fell down, that's your problem. But what if it fell onto your neighbor's property? Or heaven forbid on your neighbor's actual neighbor? The Code of Ur-Nammu had an answer for that too. If a wall collapsed and caused damage, the owner of the faulty wall was liable. This makes perfect sense, of course, but it leads to some rather amusing scenarios in your head. You can picture a Sumerian homeowner frantically inspecting every brick, tapping it, nervously muttering, "Is this a fine-worthy crack or just a charming bit of ancient character?" It's like today's building codes, but instead of a certificate of occupancy, you got a bill for 10 shekels of silver. The Sumerians were incredibly practical, and their laws reflect this. They weren't just about grand moral pronouncements. They were about resolving everyday disputes that arose in a busy agricultural society. From irrigation channels overflowing to a worker accidentally damaging tools, there was probably a specific clause, or at least a precedent for it. This level of detail makes the laws feel surprisingly modern, like they were constantly trying to preempt the next neighborhood squabble. One quirky tidbit, not directly from Ur-Nammu, but relevant to the general legal philosophy, is the concept of a trial by ordeal that sometimes popped up in Mesopotamia. For certain serious accusations like witchcraft or infidelity, the accused might be thrown into a sacred river. If they floated, they were innocent, the river god saved them. If they sank and drowned, well, tough luck, guilty as charged. This system, while seemingly brutal, also has a darkly comedic element to it. Imagine being the Sumerian judge trying to keep a straight face while explaining to the accused that their fate rests on whether the tigress decides they're a witch. Good luck and try to float court adjourned. So you see, the Sumerian legal system, with its focus on detailed fines and its pragmatic approach to everyday problems, creates a truly fascinating, sometimes comical picture of ancient life. It reminds us that even at the dawn of civilization, people were people prone to accidents, squabbles, and the occasional runaway ox. As you've gathered, the Sumerians were big on assigning a precise value to everything, even something as intangible as a social slight. So when it came to interpersonal squabbles, their laws often swung from the deeply practical to the utterly ridiculous, making for some truly amusing scenarios. Imagine walking through the bustling marketplace trying to haggle for some fresh dates, and suddenly things get hairy. Let's talk about beard pulling. Yes, you heard that right. In ancient Sumer, pulling someone's beard wasn't just rude, it was a punishable offense. Now you might chuckle, but remember, beards in Mesopotamia were often symbols of dignity, wisdom, and even social status. So if you, in a fit of pique during a heated argument over, say, the price of a particularly lopsided clay pot, reached out and gave old Nana Suan's magnificent beard a mighty tug, you were in for a fine. The Code of Ur-Nammu, or similar contemporary legal texts, would specify the exact amount of silver you owed for such an egregious act of follicle assault. It's like today's laws against assault, but with a highly specific clause for egregious, hair-related incidents. "Sir, I demand justice. He disrespected my facial topiary." This tells you something important about Sumerian society. Honor and public perception mattered immensely. While we might find the idea of a beard-pulling fine comical, it underscored a serious breach of social decorum. It's a bit like someone keying your brand new chariot today. It's not physical harm, but it's a direct attack on your property and dignity. Historians still argue whether the detailed nature of fines for minor insults reflects a litigious society or a strong cultural emphasis on maintaining public order and personal honor. Now, from the literal pulling of hair to the metaphorical pulling of hair, let's consider bridal disputes. Oh yes, even the sacred institution of marriage wasn't immune to the occasional legal snafu, sometimes with quite humorous outcomes. Imagine a scenario where a man gave a gift to his chosen bride's father, a common practice for sealing betrothal. But then for whatever reason, perhaps he got cold feet, or maybe he discovered she had an unmanageable flock of geese. He changed his mind and decided not to marry her. What happened to the gift? The law was clear. The gift was lost. The father got to keep it. Fair enough, right? He wasted the father's time. But what if the father decided to back out after accepting the gift? Perhaps a wealthier suitor came along with a better offer, or maybe the first suitor's oxen were consistently escaping into the neighbor's barley. Remember that from before. In this case, the law dictated that the father had to return double the value of the gift. This is where it gets amusingly pragmatic. It's not about hurt feelings, it's about a financial penalty for breaching a contract. You can picture the hapless suitor after being jilted confidently strolling back to his almost father-in-law's house demanding double compensation. Sorry, pal, my heartbreak comes with a cash equivalent thanks to Ur-Nammu. It makes you wonder how many Sumerian fathers suddenly developed a very keen eye for potential future sons-in-law once they understood the financial implications of changing their minds. One quirky tidbit about Sumerian legal tablets is their sheer volume and the often mundane nature of the cases they cover. While we have grand law codes, much of our understanding comes from thousands of individual court documents detailing everything from runaway slaves to arguments over inheritances. This mass of everyday legal squabbles provides a truly fascinating, sometimes silly glimpse into the daily lives of people thousands of years ago, reminding us that no matter the era, human nature, with all its foibles and petty disputes, remains remarkably consistent. So whether it was a tug beard or a broken engagement, Sumerian law was ready with a price tag. From the peculiar specifics of beard pulling and broken engagements, we now turn our attention to the very bedrock of Sumerian society, agriculture. You might think farming is a pretty straightforward affair, but in ancient Mesopotamia, where water was both life and a constant source of contention, the laws governing fields and irrigation could get incredibly detailed and, yes, even a little bit humorous in their meticulousness. Imagine you're a Sumerian farmer toiling under the Mesopotamian sun, relying on those precious irrigation canals to bring water from the rivers to your thirsty crops. This brings us to gardeners' woes. If you, a diligent gardener, were tasked with cultivating a field, and for some reason perhaps you got distracted by a particularly shiny piece of obsidian, or maybe you just had a really bad day, you neglected your duties and the field became barren. The law had something to say about it. You weren't just fired, you were held responsible for the lost yield. You had to measure out the average yield of that field and then pay the owner. It's like a performance review, but instead of losing your bonus, you owe your boss a wagon load of barley. Sorry, boss, my bad. Turns out basil doesn't grow itself. This level of detailed accountability highlights the Sumerians' profound understanding of their agrarian economy. Every plot of land, every drop of water was critical. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian agriculture is its reliance on complex irrigation systems, which allowed them to transform arid land into fertile fields supporting dense urban populations. These systems, however, required constant maintenance and careful management, leading to a host of potential disputes. And disputes there certainly were especially concerning water rights. In a land where rainfall was scarce, access to irrigation was everything. The laws often specified what would happen if someone intentionally or unintentionally damaged an irrigation ditch, diverted water unfairly, or simply let their water flow into their neighbor's field when it wasn't supposed to. You can picture the neighborhood arguments escalating. My water, you're taking my water for your melons and lil nadin. The legal texts often differentiate between accidental damage and deliberate malice, but the underlying principle was always about ensuring fair distribution and holding individuals accountable for their actions. It's like arguing over whose turn it is to water the community garden, But if you get it wrong, someone's entire livelihood is at stake. One quirky tidbit about Sumerian record-keeping is the vast number of administrative texts alongside their law codes. These tablets detail everything from grain distribution to livestock inventories, showcasing an incredible bureaucracy. For you living in Sumer, these documents would be the bedrock of daily life, meticulously tracking every transaction, every obligation, and every potential infraction. Historians still argue whether the complexity of Sumerian legal documentation was a reflection of genuine legal sophistication or simply an outcome of their advanced bureaucratic system. So while the idea of a gardener owing his employer for a failed crop might sound amusingly specific, it underscores a deeply practical and often unforgiving legal system rooted in the realities of their existence. Every resource was accounted for, every responsibility laid out, often with fines ready to be imposed. It tells us that even in ancient times, people understood the importance of a good harvest, and they weren't afraid to sue over a soggy field or a stolen stream of water. The humorous aspect comes from the human tendency to find ways around these rules, leading to endless detailed clauses, trying to anticipate every possible agricultural misadventure. So you've seen how the Sumerians had laws for everything from problematic oxen to unruly facial hair. Now let's wade into a fascinating and occasionally cringe-inducing aspect of their legal system: medicine. You might assume that ancient medical practices were a bit rough around the edges, and you'd be right. But the Sumerians, ever the sticklers for contracts, had very specific laws governing a physician's fees and the potentially brutal consequences for malpractice. It's like having a universal healthcare system where if the doctor messes up, he doesn't just lose his license, he loses a body part. Imagine you're a Sumerian doctor, or as they were called, an asu, a medical doctor, or an ashipu, a sorcerer exorcist, because you know holistic healing. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian medicine is that it combined empirical observations with magical and religious beliefs. They had knowledge of herb surgical procedures and even diagnostic techniques recorded on clay tablets. So if you, the Asu, successfully treated a broken bone or performed a minor surgery, the code of Ur-Nammu, and later Hammurabi's code, which often built on Sumerian precedents, would spell out your exact fee. For instance, a successful operation on a nobleman might earn you 10 shekels of silver. For a commoner, it might be 5 shekels. It was a clear tiered payment system. You'd probably have a little clay tablet in your waiting room listing your prices, just like a modern clinic. Broken arm, that'll be 5 shekels. Minor exorcism, 3 shekels if the demon cooperates. Now this seems pretty straightforward, right? Get paid for your work. But here's where the humor and the terror comes in. What if you didn't succeed? What if your skillful hand slipped? This is where malpractice comes into play, and the penalties could be severe. While Ur-Nammu's code was generally gentler, later Mesopotamian codes reflecting similar principles had some truly eye-watering punishments. For example, if a doctor operated on a noble patient's eye with a bronze lancet and caused the patient to lose the eye, the doctor's own hand could be cut off. Yes, you heard that right. An eye for an eye, or rather a hand for an eye. This kind of direct retaliatory justice for medical error certainly adds a certain incentive to be very, very careful with that lancet. You can picture the doctor, hand trembling, muttering, "Just don't slip, don't slip." It certainly raises the stakes on a routine appendectomy, doesn't it? This stark contrast between a fixed fee for success and a bodily mutilation for failure reveals a very high expectation placed on medical practitioners. It's a quirky tidbit that underscores the absolute importance of skill and accountability in ancient Sumerian society, particularly when dealing with the human body. Historians still argue whether these harsh penalties were frequently enforced or served more as a deterrent, given the practical need for skilled physicians. One hopes it was the latter, otherwise Sumer would have been full of one-handed doctors. So, for you, the Sumerian patient choosing a doctor wasn't just about bedside manner, it was about wondering if this physician truly had steady hands. And for the doctor, every consultation was a careful dance between earning a living and avoiding a life-altering mistake. The gentle fines for common disputes gave way to something far more visceral when it came to life and limb. It makes you appreciate modern medical waivers, doesn't it? At least your doctor today won't lose a hand if your surgery doesn't go exactly to plan. Probably. From the delicate balance of a surgeon's hand and his fee, let's pivot to another fascinating yet occasionally thorny aspect of Sumerian society and its laws, the peculiar nuances surrounding barbers, slaves, and social status. You might think a barber just cuts hair, right? Well, in ancient Sumer, that humble profession could unexpectedly intersect with the complex legalities of human property, leading to some truly remarkable and sometimes amusingly specific legal situations. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that it was highly stratified with clear distinctions between nobles, free citizens, commoners, and slaves. Slavery was a recognized institution, often a result of debt war captivity or birth. Now imagine you're a Sumerian barber mate. You're not just trimming beards and styling elaborate braids. In a society where appearance conveyed status, barbers held a surprisingly important role. They might also perform minor surgical procedures or even remove brand marks. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky and rather unsettling Sumerian law related to barbers and slaves. If a barber without the knowledge or consent of a slave's owner shaved off the distinctive mark, perhaps a brand or a specific hairstyle that identified someone as a slave, that barber would face a severe penalty. His hand would be cut off. Yes, another hand-chopping offense. It's an astonishingly specific law, implying that this must have happened often enough to warrant such a harsh deterrent. You can picture the Sumerian barber mid-snip suddenly realizing his mistake, perhaps having mistaken a slave for a free citizen who just wanted a trendy new look. Oops, my bad, that's not a fade. That's a brand. It certainly adds a layer of extreme caution to a job typically associated with polite conversation and a steady hand. This law underscores the immense value placed on property rights even when that property was a human being. The slave's mark wasn't just identification. It was a legal declaration of ownership, and tampering with it was akin to theft or worse, an act that could potentially erase someone's legal status. For the owner, it meant protecting their investment. For the slave, it might have represented a desperate, though clearly dangerous attempt at freedom. Historians still argue whether such severe punishments were consistently applied or served more as a public warning against undermining the social order. Beyond the barber, the laws also detailed how citizens should interact with slaves, particularly runaway slaves. If you harbored a runaway slave, you could face hefty fines. If you captured one, you were entitled to a reward. This created a complex dynamic where every free Sumerian might eye every stranger with a mix of suspicion and potential financial gain. You can almost imagine wanted posters on clay tablets depicting a crude drawing of a runaway and listing the reward in barley or silver. These laws, while brutal by modern standards, offer a fascinating glimpse into the mechanics of social control and economic stability in ancient Sumer. They reveal a society deeply concerned with order, property, and the clear delineation of roles. The humor, if you can call it that, comes from the specific, almost comically precise nature of the infractions and their corresponding penalties. It reminds us that even with something as simple as a haircut, the legal implications in ancient Mesopotamia could be unexpectedly fraught with peril, especially for the poor barber wielding the sharpest bronze razor. Having navigated the razor's edge of Sumerian barbers and their interactions with the legal system, let's now step into a more convivial, though still legally regulated setting, the ancient Sumerian tavern. You might think these were just places for a refreshing drink of beer. The Sumerians loved their beer, by the way, but as with everything in this meticulously organized society, even the humble inn had its rituals, and its rowdy patrons could land you in surprisingly specific legal trouble. It's like today's bar regulations, but instead of worrying about serving minors, you're worried about revolutionary chatter. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is the ubiquity of taverns often run by women known as sabbat, and the importance of beer in their daily diet and rituals. Beer wasn't just an alcoholic beverage. It was a staple food, nutritious and safer to drink than water from often polluted sources. So if you, the weary traveler or thirsty farmer, walked into a Sumerian inn, you'd expect a certain level of peace, perhaps a bit of gossip, and of course, a frothy mug. But the innkeepers known as sabbat had serious responsibilities. They weren't just serving drinks, They were in a way gatekeepers of public order. This brings us to a quirky tidbit famously from Hammurabi's Code, which remember built on Sumerian precedents like Ur-Nammu's. If an innkeeper allowed outlaws to gather in her house and did not seize them and bring them to the palace, she herself would be put to death. Yes, you heard that correctly. Death. For not reporting suspicious characters. This isn't just about closing time. This is about being an unpaid, unwitting informant for the state. You can imagine the innkeeper nervously eyeing a group of hushed hooded figures in the corner wondering, are they just having a quiet pint or are they plotting to overthrow the king? Is my life worth finding out? It certainly puts a dampener on casual conversation. This particular law reveals a fascinating aspect of ancient Sumerian governance, a deep concern for one public order and state security. Even extending into seemingly mundane establishments, the state relied on its citizens, even innkeepers, to maintain vigilance against anything that might threaten stability. It's like every bar today having a report suspicious activity hotline, but if you don't call it, you get the death penalty. It makes you realize why ancient Mesopotamian bartenders probably had such stressed expressions. Beyond potential sedition, there were also rules about pricing and fair trade. Innkeepers were expected to charge a fair price for their beer and not to dilute it. If they were caught watering down the brew, the punishment could be severe, sometimes even involving drowning. So not only did you have to worry about spies, but you also had to ensure your beer was top-notch, or face a rather watery demise. Sorry, sir, my beer is 100% genuine barley and not 50% Tigris River water. I assure you my life depends on it. Historians still argue whether the extreme penalties for innkeepers reflected a genuine threat of organized crime or rebellion, or if they were a means of imposing strict state control over common gathering places. Either way, it suggests that stepping into a Sumerian tavern was more than just a casual outing. It was an entry into a highly regulated space where vigilance was key, and even the smallest deviation could lead to dire consequences. So next time you pour yourself a drink, spare a thought for the Sumerian innkeeper, constantly balancing the thirst of her patrons with the chilling demands of the law. From the fraught environment of Sumerian taverns, let's navigate to another crucial element of their thriving economy: trade and transportation. Given that Sumerian city-states were interconnected by a network of canals and rivers, boatmen were essential. But with any vital profession comes responsibility, and in ancient Sumer, the laws governing boatmen's faults and lost cargo could be incredibly detailed, sometimes comically, so as they tried to account for every conceivable maritime mishap. It's like having an ancient version of cargo insurance, but instead of just paying a premium, your livelihood, and sometimes more, was on the line if your Sumerian FedEx package went missing. A mainstream historical fact about Sumer is their advanced canal system, which served for both irrigation and transportation, making boat travel vital for moving goods between cities. So imagine you are a Sumerian boatman piloting your reed boat or wooden barge along a bustling canal, laden with precious barley wool or even livestock. Your job was crucial, but also fraught with peril, currents, submerged obstacles, and of course, the ever-present threat of human error. This brings us to the precise liabilities for ancient shipping accidents. The laws were remarkably specific about fault. If you, the boatman, were transporting goods and through your own negligence the boat was damaged or, heaven forbid, sank and the cargo was lost, you were personally liable for the full value of the lost goods. This wasn't some abstract corporate responsibility. It was your responsibility. You can picture the Sumerian merchant tearing his hair out, screaming, "My dates, my beautiful dates." They're at the bottom of the Euphrates and it's all your fault, boatman. It's like getting a bill for a sunken container ship directly to your personal bank account. But it gets even more detailed. What if the boat was damaged but the cargo was saved? The law would then determine the cost of repairing the boat and who was responsible for it. What if the boat accidentally crashed into another boat? Then the culpability of each boatman and the owner of the boats would be meticulously assessed. This foresight in creating detailed maritime law shows a remarkably sophisticated understanding of commercial logistics for such an early civilization. One quirky tidbit famously from Hammurabi's Code, but reflecting a Mesopotamian legal tradition, involved a boatman who ran a ferry. If he deliberately capsized his boat, he had to make good all the losses. And if he lost the boat itself, he had to pay for a new one. This highlights the high stakes involved in the direct accountability. For you, the Sumerian boatman, every voyage was a calculated risk, a constant balancing act between reaching your destination and avoiding a legal nightmare. Historians still argue whether the detailed nature of these maritime laws implies a particularly accident-prone ancient shipping industry or simply the immense economic importance placed on safe and reliable transportation. So while the image of a Sumerian boatman might seem idyllic gliding along a tranquil canal, the reality was that his livelihood and sometimes more hung precariously on his navigational skills and his ability to avoid disaster. The humor, in a dark sort of way, comes from the incredibly specific ways the law tried to anticipate every single possible way a boat could go wrong and exactly who would pay for it. It makes you realize that even without GPS or radar, ancient shipping had its share of red tape and a healthy dose of blame assignment, ensuring that no lost cargo went unpunished and no negligent boatman slept soundly. From the watery perils of Sumerian canals, let's wade into the fascinating and often surprisingly pragmatic legal territory of adultery marriage and the mundane realities of family life. You might expect ancient laws on infidelity to be steeped in moralistic condemnation and brutal punishments. And while there were certainly serious consequences, the Sumerian approach often had a surprising degree of calculation and a focus on practical solutions over pure vengeance, sometimes bordering on the comically dispassionate. A mainstream historical fact about ancient Mesopotamian society is that marriage was primarily a contractual arrangement, often involving written agreements, property exchange like dowries and bride prices, and a focus on producing legitimate heirs. It wasn't purely about romantic love, though affection certainly existed. So if you were a Sumerian husband or wife, your union had significant legal weight, and any deviation from its terms could land you in hot water, sometimes quite literally. Now let's talk about one adultery. If a wife was accused of adultery, the consequences could be severe, often involving being drowned in the river or other harsh penalties. However, here's where it gets nuanced and occasionally pragmatic. The laws sometimes distinguish between different circumstances. Was the wife caught in flagrante delicto? Was there only an accusation without proof? More importantly, did the husband care? Some laws implied that if the husband was willing to forgive his wife, then no further action was taken. It seems the state was more concerned with maintaining social order than enforcing a strict moral code if the injured party was willing to overlook it. It's like a judge asking, is this relationship salvageable, or should we just throw her in the river now? Talk about a relationship counseling session. This pragmatic approach extended to other marital disputes. For instance, if a man divorced his wife without proper legal cause, or if he abandoned her, the law stipulated specific financial compensation he had to pay her. This offered a degree of protection for wives that you might not expect in such an ancient patriarchal society. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about ensuring economic stability, especially for women who might suddenly find themselves without a provider. One quirky tidbit famously from the Code of Hammurabi, but drawing on earlier Sumerian principles, involved cases where a man was taken prisoner in war, and his wife, having no means of support, entered another relationship. If the first husband later returned, the wife was allowed to return to him, and the children from her second union remained with the second husband. This practical solution, while complex, prioritized survival and continuity over rigid moral purity. For you living in Sumer, these kinds of laws provided a framework for navigating life's messy realities, even if it meant some rather awkward family reunions. Historians still argue whether such leniency in certain cases of marital infidelity was a sign of a more flexible legal system than previously thought, or simply a reflection of economic pressures during times of conflict. So while we might view ancient laws on adultery as uniformly brutal, the Sumerian codes reveal a surprisingly complex, often financially driven system that aimed to regulate social behavior while also trying to manage the practical consequences of human actions. The humor comes from the almost detached transactional way some of these deeply personal matters were handled. It reminds us that even matters of the heart in ancient Sumer, often came down to the cold hard numbers of compensation and legal precedent. From the intricate dances of marriage and infidelity, we turn now to the delicate yet often legally tangled realm of family expansion in ancient Sumer. Not every family grew through biological means, and adoption was a common practice. But as you've come to expect from the Sumerians, these arrangements came with a host of intricate, sometimes humorous laws governing adopted children's rights and wrongs, trying to anticipate every possible familial twist and turn. It's like today's adoption laws, but with extra clauses for what happens if your adopted child tries to reclaim their biological family after growing up. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that adoption was a well-established legal institution used for various reasons to provide an heir for childless couples, to ensure care for elderly parents by adopting an adult, or even to secure apprenticeships for young people. It wasn't just an informal agreement, it was a formal contract often drawn up and witnessed. So if you, a childless Sumerian couple, decided to adopt a child, you would go through a precise legal process to ensure the adoption was binding and the child's status clear. This brings us to the wonderfully specific legal protections for adopted children and the equally specific penalties for trying to undo an adoption. For instance, if a man adopted a child and raised him, but then later disowned him, the law stipulated that the adoptive father had to pay a significant fine, often a third of the child's value as property, back to the biological family or the state. This prevented frivolous adoptions and ensured commitment. You can picture the Sumerian father having a bad day contemplating disowning his adopted son, only for his wife to pull out the clay tablet and remind him, "Remember, dear, that's a 3-minute mistake you're about to make." But what about the other side of the coin? What if the adopted child, once grown, decided they didn't like their adoptive family anymore and wanted to reconnect with their biological parents? The Sumerian law had a clause for that too, and it was rather harsh. If an adopted son, after being raised and provided for, said to his adoptive father or mother, "You are not my father, mother," that child's tongue would be cut out, or in some cases, his eye put out. Yes, another body part penalty. This truly underscores the sacredness of the adoption contract and the severe societal expectation of filial loyalty within the adoptive family. Imagine that awkward Thanksgiving dinner when young Enkidu just blurts out, "You're not my real parents." Suddenly everyone's reaching for the nearest sharp object, not for the turkey. This quirky tidbit reveals a deep concern for maintaining family structure and social order. An adopted child wasn't just a convenient heir. They were a full member of the family with all the associated duties and rights, and trying to break that bond was seen as a profound betrayal. Historians still argue whether such brutal punishments for adopted children disowning their parents were frequently carried out or served as symbolic warnings to uphold the family unit. So while adoption offered a vital pathway for family formation in ancient Sumer, it was not a casual affair. The laws surrounding it, with their detailed protections for the adopted and severe penalties for disloyalty, paint a vivid, if sometimes grimly humorous, picture of the importance of kinship and contractual obligations in Mesopotamia. It reminds us that even the tender bonds of family were firmly rooted in the intricate legal framework that governed every aspect of Sumerian life. From the delicate legal dance of adoption, let's transition to something far more dramatic and occasionally farcical: the Sumerian methods of determining guilt, particularly the accusation ordeal and the peculiar role of river gods. You might assume that ancient justice relied solely on witness testimony or crude interrogations. But in Sumer, when evidence was scarce or conflicting, they sometimes literally left it up to the deities, with results that could be both terrifying and, to our modern eyes, surprisingly comical. A mainstream historical fact about ancient Mesopotamian legal systems is the concept of divine judgment, often executed through a river ordeal or water ordeal. This wasn't unique to Sumer, but it certainly featured prominently in their judicial practices, especially for serious accusations where direct proof was lacking. So imagine you're a Sumerian accused of a crime you vehemently deny, perhaps witchcraft, or a particularly tricky case of theft, where the evidence is purely circumstantial. The local elders or a judge might decide that the best way to determine your innocence is to consult the ultimate authority of the divine. This brings us to the river ordeal. For certain accusations, especially those without clear human witnesses, the accused would be taken to a sacred river, often the Euphrates or Tigris, and thrown in. The belief was that the river god, as an impartial divine judge, would decide. If you floated, you were innocent, saved by the god, and thus absolved. If you sank and drowned well, the river god had spoken, and you were deemed guilty. Yes, a truly final judgment. You can picture the scene: the nervous accused, the solemn priests, the gathered crowd all silently watching to see if the river god was having a good day or not. Don't forget to take a deep breath before you go in, or don't if you're guilty. It's really up to you. The humor, if you can call it that, comes from the sheer terrifying unpredictability of it all. Imagine the anxious moments just before plunging into the cold, murky water. Were you a strong swimmer? Did you just have a big meal? Would the current be particularly strong that day? These very human factors, of course, had nothing to do with your guilt or innocence, but everything to do with your immediate survival. It makes you wonder how many innocent Sumerians had just never learned to swim. One quirky tidbit about the river ordeal is that the practice likely evolved to include various modifications. Sometimes they might have tied weights to the accused or had them hold on to specific objects. The precise mechanics could vary, and these variations were often debated. For you, the Sumerian, facing such a trial, your fate literally rested on the whims of a powerful river and the interpretations of the priests. Historians still argue whether the river ordeal was primarily a psychological tool to extract confessions, a ritualistic means of conflict resolution, or a genuine belief in divine intervention. The existence of such a dramatic and, in our eyes, utterly farcical method of justice highlights the Sumerians' deep spiritual beliefs and their willingness to defer to divine authority when human judgment failed. It also reminds us that, while their laws were often meticulously detailed, they also contained elements that seem incredibly alien to modern jurisprudence. So next time you're facing a tough decision, just be glad your legal system doesn't involve a forced swim in a crocodile-infested river. Having plunged into the unpredictable depths of the Sumerian river ordeal, let's now resurface into the equally fascinating, albeit less life-threatening realm of interpersonal conflicts and their surprisingly specific legal remedies. You've seen that beards were protected. Now prepare to discover what happens when Sumerian tempers flared, leading to literal and often comical mouth-related mishaps covered by laws so precise they almost beg for a reenactment. We're talking about defamation and lip-biting penalties. Yes, you heard that right. In a society where verbal arguments could escalate quickly, the Sumerians had laws to deal with both the verbal slights and the physical consequences of a heated debate. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is their high literacy rate, especially among scribes and merchants, leading to widespread written contracts and legal records. This meant that even casual insults or arguments could find their way into the legal system if they escalated. Imagine a scene in a bustling Sumerian market. You're haggling over a bundle of reeds and the vendor, feeling particularly aggrieved by your lowball offer, perhaps slanders your family name. This is where defamation comes in. While the Code of Ur-Nammu is less explicit on this than later codes, Mesopotamian legal tradition certainly dealt with false accusations and slander. If you falsely accuse someone, especially of a serious crime, you could face the same penalty as if you had committed the crime yourself. It's like an ancient karma clause where your lies could literally come back to bite you. Did he just say my mother was a goat herder of dubious reputation? I demand satisfaction or a fine, whichever is funnier. But let's get to the truly memorable part, the lip-biting penalties. This sounds like something out of a slapstick comedy, doesn't it? The law from a similar Mesopotamian period explicitly stated a fine for biting someone's nose or lip during an altercation. The specific fine varied depending on whether the injured party was a nobleman, a commoner, or a slave. For a nobleman, it was a hefty sum reflecting his higher social status and the greater insult. For a commoner, less. For a slave, an even smaller amount, sadly reflecting their legal standing as property. You can just picture the court case. Your Honor, he bit my lip. My lip, I tell you, right there during the heated discussion about the price of barley. The sheer visual absurdity of it is what makes these laws so enduringly humorous. It makes you wonder what kind of arguments Sumerians were having that frequently escalated to literal lip-biting. Perhaps they just got really passionate about grain prices. One quirky tidbit is how these physical injuries, even minor ones like a bite, were often treated with specific monetary compensation rather than reciprocal injury. This goes back to Ur-Nammu's emphasis on fines, showcasing a legal system that, while capable of harshness, also sought to provide a clear numerical value for every transgression. For you, the Sumerian, it meant that even if you got into a brawl, you always knew the precise financial cost of, say, losing an ear or having your finger broken. Historians still argue whether the detailed listing of fines for specific injuries indicates a truly sophisticated medico-legal system or simply a highly bureaucratic approach to all forms of dispute resolution. So whether it was the sting of a verbal insult or the actual pain of a lip bite, Sumerian law was ready with a price tag. These specific, sometimes oddly precise punishments reveal a society that was both formal in its legal structure and surprisingly human in its everyday squabbles. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, people were getting into arguments so ridiculous they needed a law specifically written to cover the consequences. And perhaps, just perhaps, those ancient scribes had a little chuckle while etching "fine for lip biting" onto a clay tablet. Having explored the rather painful intricacies of Sumerian interpersonal squabbles, let's now venture into a more sacred yet still surprisingly legislated domain, the temple. You might assume that divine spaces were governed solely by religious doctrine and fear of the gods. But in ancient Sumer, where temples were not just places of worship, but also massive economic centers, the laws also addressed mundane and occasionally humorous instances of misbehavior within sacred spaces. It's like having a strict dress code at church, but also a fine for accidentally knocking over the collection plate. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian civilization is the central role of temples. The ziggurat was the dominant architectural feature of many Sumerian cities, and the temple complex surrounding it often served as the administrative, economic, and spiritual heart of the community. Priests and priestesses held significant power, and the temple owned vast amounts of land, managed agricultural production, and conducted trade. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, entered the temple grounds, you were stepping into a very important and very busy institution. This brings us to the lighthearted consequences of misbehavior within sacred Sumerian spaces. Now, these weren't laws about sacrilege, which were dealt with far more severely, of course. These were about the smaller, more annoying infractions that could occur when you had a bustling temple precinct filled with people, animals, and goods. Imagine a scenario where perhaps you brought your goat to the temple for sacrifice, but it got a little too excited and started nibbling on a priest's ceremonial robes. Or perhaps during a crowded festival, you accidentally tripped over a stack of offerings and sent them tumbling. While there might not be a direct goat-nibbling clause in the surviving law codes, the general principles of damage to property or disruption of public order would apply. You'd likely face a fine for the damage, or perhaps be made to provide a replacement offering. It's like a cosmic equivalent of paying for a broken vase in a museum gift shop. Sir, your goat has a fine for inappropriate chewing and possibly a behavioral consultation. The humor here comes from imagining the Sumerian scribes having to deal with these petty incidents. While the gods were mighty and terrible, their earthly representatives, the priests, still had to contend with the everyday realities of human and animal clumsiness. These laws, though perhaps not explicitly detailed in every surviving fragment, hint at a system that had to cover all bases, even the slightly ridiculous ones. One quirky tidbit from later Mesopotamian practice, but drawing on earlier traditions, involved rules about oaths sworn by the gods in a temple. If someone swore a false oath in a temple, the punishment could be severe, sometimes even death. But what if you simply broke a minor rule, perhaps tried to sell some unauthorized goods near the temple entrance, or let your donkey wander into a restricted area? These were the kinds of infractions that would be handled with a fine, reflecting the temple's dual role as a sacred site and a practical economic hub. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of extensive laws directly related to minor sacred space infractions in early codes means they were handled informally, or if such details simply haven't been discovered yet. So while reverence was paramount, the Sumerian temple was also a place where you could commit minor blunders and face a fine rather than divine wrath. It tells us that even the holiest of sites had to contend with the very human tendency for mischief and accidental missteps. And it gives us a charming, if slightly anachronistic image of a Sumerian official patiently explaining to a sheepish citizen that yes, their offering was accepted, but the repair bill for the broken ceremonial pot would be arriving shortly. From the sacred precincts of Sumerian temples, let's transition back to the bustling, sun-baked fields that fed their cities. You've already encountered laws about errant oxen and neglected gardens, but the Sumerian agricultural landscape also involved complex arrangements between landowners and those who worked the land. This brings us to field rental follies and sharecropping, where the meticulous Sumerian legal mind tried to account for every possible mishap and dispute, sometimes with results that are both detailed and, to our modern eyes, amusingly precise. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian agriculture is the prevalence of various land tenure systems, including outright ownership, communal land, and significantly the leasing of fields. Landowners, often the temple or wealthy individuals, would rent out plots to farmers who would then cultivate them, sometimes paying a fixed rent and sometimes engaging in sharecropping, where the harvest was divided between the landowner and the farmer. You as a Sumerian farmer might find yourself entering into such a contract, hoping for a bountiful harvest and a fair division of the spoils. Now imagine the complexities. What if the harvest wasn't bountiful? What if there was a drought, a flood, or a pestilence? This is where the laws got incredibly detailed, trying to allocate risk and responsibility. For instance, if a farmer rented a field, but then failed to cultivate it or simply abandoned it, the law would stipulate fines based on the presumed average yield of that field. You'd be on the hook for the expected harvest, even if you never put a single seed in the ground. It's like renting an apartment, deciding not to live in it, and still having to pay rent, but instead of money, it's 60 gewer of barley. Sorry, landlord, I just wasn't feeling the vibe with this particular plot. But it gets even more specific and where the follies come in. What if the landowner, for some reason, wanted to take the field back before the harvest? Or what if the farmer, after putting in all the hard work, decided he wanted to abandon the field before the crop was ready? The laws often had clauses for these scenarios, specifying compensation for labor or penalties for breach of contract. This level of detail shows a society acutely aware of the practicalities and potential pitfalls of agricultural agreements. You can picture a Sumerian legal scribe with a weary sigh, etching yet another clause onto a clay tablet. And if the farmer's mood changes with the south wind, causing him to abandon the field of the third row, one quirky tidbit found in various Mesopotamian legal texts involved provisions for natural disasters. If a field was ravaged by an act of God, a flood say, the law sometimes stipulated that the farmer was exempt from paying rent for that year. This suggests a recognition of forces beyond human control and a desire for a degree of fairness even in the face of nature's wrath. For you, the Sumerian farmer, it meant that while you might lose your crop, you wouldn't necessarily lose your shirt as well. Historians still argue whether these clauses for natural disasters were always honored in practice, or if powerful landowners often found ways around them. So while sharecropping and field rentals might seem like dry legal matters, the Sumerian laws governing them reveal a vibrant, often contentious agricultural society trying to codify every conceivable risk and dispute. The humor emerges from the meticulousness with which they attempted to regulate unpredictable natural phenomena and the ever-present human tendency for shifting plans or lazy cultivation. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, contracts were king, and nobody wanted to be left holding an empty basket when the harvest came in. From the detailed world of Sumerian field rentals, let's now consider a pervasive yet often legally complex aspect of ancient society: slavery. While certainly not humorous in itself, the Sumerian laws surrounding runaway slaves and reward systems reveal a fascinating mix of property rights, human behavior, and the occasional opportunity for unexpected profit, sometimes with darkly comical undertones in their specificity. It's like a human scavenger hunt, where the prize is silver and the stakes are someone's freedom. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that slavery was a deeply embedded institution, distinct from later forms, often arising from debt capture in war or being born to a slave mother. Slaves, while considered property, did have some legal protections and could even engage in limited economic activities. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, owned a slave, they represented a significant investment, and their disappearance was a serious financial loss. This brings us to the laws concerning runaway slaves. If your slave decided to make a break for it, the law recognized your right to reclaim them. But what if someone else found your runaway slave? This is where the reward system came into play. The law stipulated that anyone who captured and returned a runaway slave was entitled to a specific reward, usually a certain amount of silver. This created an incentive for vigilance among the general populace. You can picture Sumerian citizens walking along the canals or through the marketplace, subtly eyeing strangers, wondering if they might be a valuable runaway. That gait, those clothes, could that be a 5 shekel runaway? Or just a free citizen with a really bad sense of direction? It turns the entire society into a network of potential bounty hunters driven by the lure of a quick profit. The humor, in a rather dark and uncomfortable way, comes from the sheer transactional nature of the system. It reduces a human being's desperate bid for freedom to a calculable commodity, a lost item with a finder's fee. It also implies a certain frequency of these escapes. If it happened rarely, why bother legislating a reward? The law suggests a persistent issue with slaves attempting to flee, despite the harsh consequences if caught. One quirky tidbit, famously from Hammurabi's code, but applicable to the broader Mesopotamian legal tradition, involves severe penalties for harboring a runaway slave. If you knowingly kept a runaway slave in your house and did not bring them out to the authorities, you faced death. This highlights the state's absolute commitment to property rights and its zero-tolerance policy for undermining the institution of slavery. For you, the Sumerian householder, it meant that offering sanctuary to a desperate soul came with an incredibly steep, possibly fatal price. Historians still argue whether the detailed laws regarding runaway slaves indicate a widespread problem with escapes or a strong legal framework designed to prevent them from becoming widespread. So while the institution of slavery itself is certainly not humorous, the specific laws crafted around runaways and rewards offer a peculiar glimpse into Sumerian society. It shows a legal system meticulously designed to protect property even when that property was human, and to enlist the entire community in its enforcement, often by appealing to their sense of financial gain. It reminds us that even human freedom could be reduced to a legal transaction with precise values and a very clear incentives for participation in its retrieval. From the unsettling dynamics of runaway slaves, let's now trot over to the pastures and plains of ancient Sumer, where another essential profession found itself heavily and sometimes amusingly regulated, the kerm, shepherd. Tani, you might think a shepherd's life is peaceful, just you, your flock, and the wide-open Mesopotamian sky. But in a society where sheep and goats were vital for wool, milk, and meat, a shepherd's duties were incredibly stringent, leading to intricate, sometimes amusingly detailed responsibilities for ancient shepherds, and dire consequences for lost flocks. It's like managing a very fluffy, very stubborn, and very valuable investment portfolio where every lost asset is coming straight out of your pocket. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is the immense importance of pastoralism. Alongside agriculture, flocks of sheep and goats provided essential resources, and skilled shepherds were highly valued. So if you were a Sumerian shepherd, your job wasn't just about leisurely leading your flock to fresh grazing lands. It was a weighty responsibility, often governed by detailed contracts between you and the flock's owner. This brings us to the precise and rather amusingly specific liabilities for shepherds and their precious charges. The laws often stipulated what would happen if a shepherd was negligent. For instance, if a shepherd turned his flock over to a lion or a wolf, presumably by falling asleep on the job or just being incredibly unlucky, he had to pay full restitution for every animal lost. That seems fair, right? But it gets better. What if the animals were lost through no fault of his own? Some texts suggest that if a shepherd could prove that the animals were taken by an act of God or force majeure, like a flood or a particularly aggressive pack of wild dogs that he couldn't reasonably fight off, he might be exempt. But the burden of proof was on him. You can picture the shepherd frantically collecting claw marks and paw prints to prove it wasn't just a moment of inattention. Your Honor, these gnaw marks clearly indicate a direwolf, not my cousin, Susudra's notoriously clumsy sheepdog. Torinchanarifern kinekuniarmi. The humorous aspect in a grim sort of way comes from the level of detail they expected from these shepherds. They weren't just herd watchers, they were asset managers responsible for counting every lamb and every ewe. The laws even specified what would happen if a shepherd mingled his flock with another's and then couldn't separate them, or if he allowed disease to spread through negligence. It implied a constant state of vigilance where every bleat and every stray hoofprint could have legal ramifications. It's like having a daily inventory check for every single one of your thousands of products. One quirky tidbit is the use of sheep and goats as a common unit of exchange in early Sumerian records, indicating their economic significance. The very fabric of their accounting system was built around these animals. For you, the Sumerian shepherd, your entire livelihood and reputation depended on your ability to keep your woolly charges safe and accounted for. Historians still argue whether the detailed regulations for shepherds imply a high rate of animal loss in ancient Sumer, or simply reflect the extreme economic value placed on livestock and the desire for clear accountability. So while the image of a shepherd might conjure up peaceful pastoral scenes, the Sumerian reality was a bit more high stakes. Every lost lamb was a potential fine, every wandering goat a legal headache. These intricate laws reveal a society deeply invested in its agricultural wealth and prepared to legislate every possible contingency, even down to the whereabouts and well-being of every single sheep in the Sumerian plains. It reminds us that even at the dawn of civilization, the legal system was ready to come down on you for a misplaced goat. From the shepherd's unending vigilance over his flock, let's delve into another complex and often desperate corner of Sumerian legal life. Debt. You might think that being in debt in ancient times meant immediate brutal slavery, and while debt servitude was certainly a reality, the Sumerians, with their pragmatic legal minds, also created surprising escape clauses and legal complexities for debt slaves, making it a less absolute, though still incredibly difficult predicament. It's like being trapped in a particularly bad subscription service, but with a few incredibly narrow, legally binding ways to cancel if you read the fine print. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that once debt slavery was a significant social and economic issue. Individuals or even entire families could fall into debt due to crop failures, illness, or other misfortunes, and if unable to repay, they might enter into temporary servitude to their creditor. This wasn't chattel slavery for life, but a period of forced labor until the debt was considered paid. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, found yourself in crushing debt, you might face the grim prospect of selling yourself or a family member into temporary servitude. This brings us to the escape clauses, or more accurately, the defined limits of debt servitude. While the Code of Ur-Nammu is fragmentary on this later Mesopotamian codes, particularly Hammurabi's built upon a tradition of protecting debtors to a degree. For instance, laws often stipulated that debt servitude was limited to a certain number of years, typically 3 years. After that period, the debt slave was to be freed, regardless of whether the debt was fully repaid. This was a remarkable protection for the time, offering a definite end to the period of servitude. You can picture the Sumerian debt slave counting down the days, muttering, "Only 730 more sunrises until I can argue over barley prices again as a free person." The humor, in a rather dark vein, comes from the very detailed rules around these limits. What if the master tried to keep the debt slave longer? What if the debt slave died during servitude? The laws tried to cover every angle, ensuring that the system, while harsh, was at least predictable. It also meant that masters had an incentive to treat their debt slaves reasonably well, knowing they were temporary labor, not permanent property. One quirky tidbit involves specific provisions for different types of debt, like those involving loans of grain versus loans of silver. The interest rates and repayment terms could vary, making the life of a Sumerian debt collector a truly complex affair. For you, the Sumerian debtor, navigating these intricacies might have been your only hope. Historians still argue whether the practice of limiting debt servitude was a genuine humanitarian concern or a pragmatic recognition that excessively long periods of servitude were unproductive and destabilizing for society. So while debt slavery was a grim reality, the Sumerians, in their meticulous legal fashion, built in mechanisms that offered a glimmer of hope and a defined end to the ordeal. The very existence of these escape clauses shows a legal system attempting to balance the rights of creditors with a societal need to prevent perpetual servitude. It reminds us that even within harsh ancient legal frameworks, there were surprising nuances offering a fascinating, if sometimes grimly amusing insight into the complex economic and social challenges of ancient Sumer. Having explored the nuanced world of debt servitude, let's now delve into the equally intricate and sometimes hilariously complicated realm of Sumerian family law, specifically when it came to lineage. You might think paternity is a straightforward matter, but in ancient Sumer, it often presented unique paternity puzzles, and the legal status of unwed mothers came with its own set of fascinating and occasionally amusing challenges and solutions. It's like a daytime talk show, ancient Sumerian style, but instead of DNA tests, they had intricate legal precedents and community testimony. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that legitimacy and lineage were incredibly important, especially for inheritance and social status. Children were vital for perpetuating family lines and ensuring care in old age. Marriage was the primary means of establishing paternity, but as in any society, life didn't always follow the neat lines of legal contracts. This brings us to the paternity puzzles. What happened if a child was born outside of a recognized marriage, or if a man denied fathering a child? The Sumerian legal system had to grapple with these scenarios. While less explicitly detailed in the Code of Ur-Nammu compared to later codes like Hammurabi's, the broader Mesopotamian legal tradition showed a clear concern for ensuring children had a recognized father, even if it wasn't always straightforward. For instance, laws might stipulate that if a man acknowledged a child as his own, even if born to a concubine or a slave, that child could gain legal rights, sometimes even inheritance rights. This reveals a pragmatic approach to ensuring children were not left without support. Now for the slightly more amusing side. Imagine a man who perhaps after a regrettable evening finds himself accused of fathering a child. If he denied it and there was no marriage contract, how was it proven? Sometimes it relied on witness testimony from the community, people who had seen the couple together or heard the man acknowledge the child in the past. You can picture the Sumerian court proceedings. Did you and Kidu see the accused Nabu-Kuduri-Ushur bringing little shogi clay toys last harvest festival? Testify. It's like a neighborhood gossip circle but with legal ramifications. The potential for conflicting testimonies and the comical scenarios of trying to piece together a story based on ancient rumors is quite vivid. And what about the Wani unwed mothers? While society clearly favored marriage for childbearing, Sumerian law did offer some protections. For instance, if a concubine bore a child to a free man, the child often had more rights than a child born from a casual encounter, sometimes even being elevated to the status of a legitimate heir, if the father formally acknowledged them. This wasn't about moral judgment, it was about ensuring economic stability and succession. One quirky tidbit from later periods but reflecting earlier traditions involves a law where if a woman's husband was captured in war and presumed dead and she remarried and had children, but then the first husband returned, the children from the second marriage remained with the second husband. This pragmatism, while for different circumstances, shows a consistent theme of prioritizing the child's stability and the practical realities of life over rigid moralistic interpretations of family structure. Historians still argue whether the apparent flexibility in some paternity cases was a sign of a relatively liberal social environment or a necessary adaptation to the fluid realities of ancient life. So while the Sumerians cherished established family structures, their laws also bravely tackled the messy realities of human relationships. These paternity puzzles and the legal nuances for unwed mothers offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly detailed glimpse into a society determined to provide a legal framework for every conceivable aspect of human interaction, even when it involved a little detective work and a lot of community testimony. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, trying to figure out who's the daddy was a legal conundrum. From the complex world of Sumerian paternity puzzles, let's now consider a more direct, yet equally specific area of Sumerian law: good assault and bodily injury. You might envision ancient justice as purely an eye for an eye, but while that principle did exist in later Mesopotamian codes, the Sumerians often opted for a different and sometimes amusingly precise form of compensation: the price of an eye, or a tooth, or a broken limb. It's like having a very literal ancient version of an insurance claims adjuster, where every body part has a fixed monetary value. A mainstream historical fact about the Code of Ur-Nammu is its preference for monetary compensation weregild over physical retaliation for injuries, a significant departure from the later lex talionis. Eye for an eye principle found in Hammurabi's code. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, got into a physical altercation and accidentally or perhaps intentionally injured someone, you weren't necessarily going to lose a limb yourself. Instead, you'd be looking at a bill. This brings us to the very specific and rather comical compensations for various bodily injuries. The law would precisely state, if a man has cut off another man's foot, he shall pay 10 shekels of silver. If he has shattered another man's bone with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. And yes, if he has knocked out a tooth of a man, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. You can picture the detailed medical legal ledger: broken arm 1 mina, missing tooth 2 shekels, stubbed toe if it caused permanent limping, perhaps a half shekel and an apology. It's like a gruesome ancient menu of injuries, each with its own specific price tag. Imagine the Sumerian brawl where one person screams, "That's a 10 shekel kick, you brute, im." The humor in a dark and specific way comes from the sheer precision. It implies a society that had meticulously categorized every conceivable injury and assigned it a fixed value. It also suggests that these kinds of minor and not-so-minor altercations were common enough to warrant such detailed legal attention. It makes you wonder if there were professional injury assessors who would come to the scene with their scales and measures. One quirky tidbit is that the compensation often varied depending on the social status of the injured party. Injuring a nobleman would cost you significantly more than injuring a commoner or, sadly, a slave. This tiered system, while reflecting the social hierarchies of the time, also adds to the peculiar nature of the price list for body parts. For you, the Sumerian, it meant that your social standing literally determined the financial value of your physical well-being. Historians still argue whether the preference for monetary compensation in Ur-Nammu's code was a sign of a more civilized legal system or simply a pragmatic solution in a society with a robust monetary economy. So while fighting might have been an unavoidable part of ancient life, the Sumerians had a surprisingly bureaucratic way of dealing with the aftermath. Instead of seeking bloody revenge, you were encouraged to seek financial recompense. These laws about assault and the price of an eye offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly detached glimpse into a legal system that truly put a price on everything, even your teeth. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, a good lawyer could probably tell you exactly how much your missing finger was worth in silver. From the detailed bodily injury price lists, let's now transition to another everyday, yet often legally intricate aspect of Sumerian life: lost and found. You might think that finding someone else's misplaced possession is a simple matter of honesty, but in ancient Sumer, where every object had value and legal ownership was paramount, the laws governing lost property and found treasures were surprisingly specific, sometimes bordering on the comically cautious, trying to prevent both theft and unjust enrichment. It's like a very formal ancient version of a lost and found box, where if you pick up the wrong thing, you might owe a hefty fine. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is their sophisticated record-keeping, enabled by cuneiform writing, which tracked everything from temple inventories to personal property. This meticulousness extended to legal matters, ensuring clear ownership of goods. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, were walking along a busy street or working in a field and stumbled upon something that clearly wasn't yours, you couldn't just pocket it. This brings us to the Hasu oddly specific laws for returning lost items and reporting discoveries. The general principle was that if you found something valuable, you were expected to make an effort to return it to its owner. If you kept it, it was considered theft. But what constituted making an effort? The laws might describe things like bringing the item to the town elder or publicly declaring your find. For instance, some later Mesopotamian laws stipulated that if a lost ox or donkey was found, the finder had to announce it in the town square for a certain number of days. If the owner didn't claim it within that time, the finder might get to keep it, but they often had to pay a fee to the temple or the local authorities. You can picture the finder reluctantly dragging a stubborn lost goat into the bustling square, shouting, "Lost goat! Anyone lose a goat? Otherwise, I suppose it's my goat now? After I pay the temple tax, of course." The humor here comes from the sheer bureaucratic hoops you might have to jump through to do the right thing. It implies a society where people were constantly on the lookout for lost items, not just to return them, but because there was a clear legal process involved and a potential benefit or penalty if you tried to cheat the system. It's like a formal civic duty, but with a slight exasperation for the finder. One quirky tidbit involves what happened if you found a treasure like buried gold or silver. The laws often stated that such a find had to be reported, and sometimes the treasure would be divided between the finder and the landowner, or even claimed by the temple or the state. This prevented individuals from suddenly becoming wealthy without proper oversight and ensured that valuable resources were accounted for. For you, the Sumerian treasure hunter, or accidental discoverer, it meant that striking it rich was less about a lucky find and more about navigating a complex legal division of spoils. Historians still argue whether the detailed laws on lost property reflect a high incidence of misplaced goods or a strong emphasis on honesty and property rights in Sumerian society. So while finders keepers might be a modern playground rule in ancient Sumer, it was a legally complex and potentially risky proposition. These laws about lost property and found treasures reveal a society obsessed with order and ownership, ensuring that even the most accidental discovery had a clear legal pathway. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, if you picked up something shiny off the ground, you might already be inadvertently signing up for a complicated legal process. From the mundane yet legally tangled realm of lost and found, let's now look at a consequence that could be far more catastrophic and in its legal implications, almost comically literal. Building collapse and builder's blame. You might think that if a structure falls down, it's just bad luck. But in ancient Sumer, where mud brick construction was ubiquitous, the laws held builders to an astonishingly high standard, ensuring that responsibility for failures was assigned with brutal and sometimes eye-for-an-eye precision. It's like today's construction liability laws, but instead of just losing your bond, you might lose your life. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian civilization is their impressive architectural achievements, from monumental ziggurats to complex irrigation systems and multi-story houses, all largely built with sun-dried or kiln-fired mud bricks. Despite their skill, ancient construction techniques weren't infallible, and collapses could happen. So if you, a Sumerian builder, were contracted to construct a house, temple, or granary, you were taking on immense responsibility, not just for the structure itself, but for the lives and property within and around it. This brings us to their every direct, sometimes comically literal responsibility for construction failures. While the Code of Ur-Nammu being earlier focuses more on monetary compensation for bodily harm, the principles seen in later Mesopotamian codes, particularly Hammurabi's, undoubtedly reflect earlier Sumerian ideas. If a builder constructed a house and it subsequently collapsed, causing the death of the owner, the builder himself was put to death. If it caused the death of the owner's son, the builder's own son was put to death. If it caused the death of the owner's daughter, the builder's daughter was executed. Yes, you heard that right. This is the infamous eye for an eye principle applied with chilling precision to faulty construction. You can picture the Sumerian builder, after finishing a house, standing nervously across the street, watching for any telltale cracks, muttering, please hold, my son's future depends on it." Soberly, it makes you wonder how many ancient Sumerian building inspectors just stayed home and prayed. The humor, in a very dark and specific way, comes from the sheer, almost absurd directness of the punishment. It wasn't about fines. It was about mirroring the exact loss. This shows a society that valued human life, particularly that of free citizens, immensely and held professionals to an incredibly high standard. It also implies a strong communal oversight. Everyone in the neighborhood would know who built whose house. One quirky tidbit, also from later codes but rooted in Sumerian commercial practice, involved what happened if the house collapsed but no one died. Perhaps it just damaged property. In that case, the builder was usually liable for rebuilding the house at his own expense. This, while less dramatic, still represents a significant financial loss and a powerful deterrent against shoddy workmanship. For you, the Sumerian builder, every brick laid, every beam placed, was a matter of life and death, both for your clients and for your own family. Historians still argue whether these extreme penalties were consistently enforced or if they served primarily as a powerful legal and social deterrent against negligence in a vital industry. So while the Sumerians built impressive structures, their laws ensured that the builders carried a very heavy burden of responsibility. These statutes about building collapse and builders' blame offer a fascinating, albeit grimly humorous glimpse into a legal system that truly believed in direct accountability, ensuring that if your dream home became a nightmare, someone, perhaps even your son, would pay the ultimate price. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, home warranties had very, very high stakes. From the weighty consequences of collapsing buildings, let's shift our gaze back to the more lively, if sometimes equally troublesome inhabitants of ancient Sumer, their animals. You've already heard about mischievous oxen trampling crops, but the Sumerian legal system went even further, detailing the amusing yet legally binding responsibility for your mischievous livestock, ensuring that every bray, bark, or bite could land an owner in legal hot water. It's like today's pet liability laws, but instead of just covering vet bills, you might be paying out in barley or even in lives. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian life is the close integration of animals into daily existence. Livestock like oxen, donkeys, sheep, goats, and even dogs were essential for agriculture, transportation, food, and security. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, owned animals, they were not just companions or tools. They were active participants in the economy and society, and their actions had legal ramifications. This brings us to the amusing yet legally binding responsibility for your mischievous livestock. The laws were remarkably specific about owner liability for animal-related incidents. For instance, what if your bull, known to be prone to goring people, was not kept properly secured and gored a man to death? If the owner had been warned about the bull's dangerous nature and failed to take precautions, the law from later Mesopotamian codes, but reflective of earlier Sumerian principles, could decree a heavy fine or even death for the owner. It's like a strict 3 strikes and you're out rule for dangerous pets, where the out is for the owner. You can picture the anxious Sumerian farmer trying to explain to the judge, "But Your Honor, Fluffy is usually so gentle. He only ever headbutts the mailman." But it gets even more detailed and often quite funny in its specificity. What if your ox, while being driven, gored a free man's slave to death? The owner might have to pay a portion of the slave's value. What if a dog bit someone? The owner would be liable for compensation depending on the severity of the bite and the dog's known temperament. These laws suggest that ancient Sumer was a place where animals were constantly getting into trouble and their owners were perpetually on the hook. It's like a never-ending episode of Animal Court, but with actual serious fines. One quirky tidbit, famously from Hammurabi's Code, involved what happened if a bull, while on the loose, gored a man to death, but the owner had not been warned about its dangerous nature. In this case, the owner was still liable, but the fine was significantly less than if they had been negligent. This distinction reveals a nuanced legal understanding of culpability, differentiating between known risks and unavoidable accidents. For you, the Sumerian animal owner, it meant that ignorance wasn't a total excuse, but it might save you some silver. Historians still argue whether the detailed animal laws reflect a particularly high incidence of animal-related injuries or merely the immense economic value of livestock that necessitated strict regulation. So while your ancient Sumerian pet might have offered companionship or labor, it also came with a hefty legal responsibility. These laws about animal mischief and owner liability offer a truly fascinating, sometimes hilariously specific glimpse into a society that took its livestock and their antics very seriously. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, if your pet caused a ruckus, you were probably going to hear about it in court. And perhaps, just perhaps, it led to a lot of Sumerians keeping very, very docile sheep. From the delightful perils of Sumerian pet ownership, let's turn our attention to the persistent human temptation that transcends all eras. Theft. Ihirun. You might assume ancient laws against stealing were simple and brutal. And while they certainly could be, the Sumerian legal system also contained the straightforward, sometimes disproportionate penalties for various acts of theft, often involving multiples of the stolen item, creating situations that could be both severe and, to our modern sensibilities, oddly specific. It's like a very strict ancient shoplifting policy where if you steal a single loaf of bread, you might owe the baker a whole bakery. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is their complex economic system involving markets, trade, and private property. With wealth concentrated in city-states and temples, the temptation to acquire goods through illicit means was ever present. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, decided to try your hand at petty larceny, you were stepping into a legal minefield with very clear and often heavy consequences. This brings us to the mark straightforward, sometimes disproportionate penalties for various acts of theft. The laws were often based on a principle of restitution, but multiplied. For example, if you stole an ox, you didn't just return the ox. You paid a multiple of its value. Some codes might stipulate paying 10 times the value of a stolen ox. Imagine stealing a single animal and then having to come up with the equivalent of a whole herd. Your Honor, I only took one ox. How am I supposed to pay for 10? Do I look like a cattle baron? This kind of multiplier creates a wonderfully vivid image of ancient Sumerian debtors frantically trying to repay their theft debt. And what about temples? As you'll recall, temples were immense economic powerhouses full of valuable goods and offerings. Theft from a temple was considered particularly heinous, a crime against both state and deity. The penalties were accordingly severe, often involving capital punishment or truly massive fines, sometimes even 30 times the value of the stolen object. You can picture the Sumerian thief sneaking into a temple at night, eyeing a golden statue, blissfully unaware that if caught, he's not just facing jail time, but a multi-generational debt for his family. The humor, in a dark way, comes from the mathematical absurdity of these penalties. While designed to be a powerful deterrent, they also create scenarios of almost impossible restitution. It suggests a legal system that was less about nuanced justice and more about sending a very clear, very expensive message. It's like accidentally walking out of a grocery store with a candy bar and getting a bill for a new car. One quirky tidbit, famously from Hammurabi's Code, but drawing on older Sumerian traditions, involves stealing from specific locations or people. Stealing from a palace or a temple often carried the death penalty, while stealing from a commoner might carry a fine. This distinction highlights the hierarchy of Sumerian society and the varied value placed on different types of property and victims. For you, the Sumerian, it meant that choosing where to steal was as important as what to steal. Historians still argue whether the severity of theft penalties indicates a high incidence of crime or a legal system designed to instill absolute deference to authority and property rights. So while the temptation to take what wasn't yours was certainly present in ancient Sumer, the laws against theft ensured that the consequences far outweighed the potential gain. These statutes about theft temples and treble fines offer a fascinating, sometimes grimly amusing glimpse into a legal system that believed in making the punishment so disproportionate it would serve as an unforgettable lesson. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, crime didn't pay, especially when the payment involved 30 oxen for one pilfered sheep. From the severe multiplied penalties for theft, let's pivot to a particularly interesting and often ironically amusing aspect of Sumerian law: what happened when you made a false accusation. You might assume that simply lying in court would earn you a slap on the wrist. But in ancient Sumer, where truth and testimony were crucial, the legal system had a very specific and quite poetic form of retaliatory justice, awaiting those who dared to accuse others falsely. It's like an ancient version of hoist by your own petard, where your attempts to bring someone down could spectacularly backfire, leaving you facing the very same fate you wished on them. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian legal proceedings is the importance of witness testimony and oaths. When a serious crime was alleged, the court would gather evidence and hear from witnesses. However, in a society without modern forensic techniques, the veracity of testimony was paramount, and false accusations could be incredibly damaging, destroying reputations and livelihoods. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, decided to accuse your neighbor, Enkidumu, of, say, stealing your prized two-horned goat, you'd better be absolutely certain of your facts. This brings us to the humorous, almost ironic fate awaiting those who falsely accused others. The law famously present in Hammurabi's code, but rooted in earlier Mesopotamian legal traditions, stipulated that if a man brought an accusation of a capital crime, one punishable by death against another man, and could not prove it, then the accuser himself would be put to death. Yes, death for a false accusation, it's the ultimate "you broke it, you bought it" scenario. You can picture the Sumerian accuser confidently pointing fingers, only to have the judge calmly explain, "Well, since you can't prove he did it, you clearly did it. Off with his head, I suppose." This form of lex talionis applied directly to the accuser, turning the tables in a truly dramatic fashion. It certainly encouraged careful consideration before making serious allegations. Imagine second-guessing every word before speaking. Is this accusation worth my life? Perhaps I just miscounted my goats. The humor, dark as it may be, comes from the sheer mirroring of the punishment. It's an almost perfect, albeit terrifying, karmic loop. It highlights a legal system that was deeply concerned with the integrity of its judicial process and sought to deter frivolous or malicious accusations with the most extreme consequences. It also meant that defending oneself against a false accusation was not just about proving innocence, but about ensuring the accuser faced their just deserts. One quirky tidbit involves cases where the accused was subjected to the river ordeal. Remember that from before, and if they survived proving their innocence, the accuser would then be put to death for the false accusation. This added another layer of divine and potentially watery irony to the justice system. For you, the Sumerian, it meant that your reputation was fiercely protected by the law, and anyone trying to undermine it faced dire personal risks. Historians still argue whether the severity of these false accusation penalties indicates a pervasive problem with malicious gossip or a profound societal value placed on truth and justice within the legal system. So while seeking justice was certainly encouraged in ancient Sumer, doing so falsely was a perilous endeavor. These statutes about false accusations and retaliatory justice offer a fascinating, sometimes grimly amusing glimpse into a legal system that didn't just punish crimes, but also fiercely protected the integrity of its own process. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, if you cried wolf in the courtroom, you might just find yourself becoming the next meal. From the rather poetic, if terrifying, justice for false accusers, let's now turn to the everyday grind of earning a living in ancient Sumer. You might think that in an ancient economy, labor was simply a matter of muscle and command, but the Sumerians, ever the meticulous record keepers and contract makers, had surprisingly detailed laws concerning wages, defaults, and worker rights, ensuring a degree of fairness and predictability in their bustling labor market. It's like an ancient HR department, but instead of emailing contracts, they were etched in clay, and disputes often ended in court, not mediation. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian economy is its reliance on both agricultural labor and specialized craftspeople, all operating within a sophisticated system of contracts and payments, often in silver, barley, or other commodities. From farmers to bricklayers, weavers to scribes, various professions had established rates for their work. So if you, a Sumerian laborer, were hired for a job, you expected to be paid fairly for your time and skill. This brings us to the surprisingly specific regulations regarding the fair pay in contract disputes for laborers. The laws would stipulate the daily or monthly wages for various types of workers. For instance, a common laborer might earn a certain amount of barley per day, while a skilled artisan would command a higher rate. But what happened if an employer defaulted on payment, or if a worker abandoned a job before it was finished? The laws were designed to address these defaults. If an employer failed to pay wages as agreed, they could be compelled by the court to pay not just the overdue amount, but sometimes an additional penalty. You can picture the Sumerian laborer confidently strolling into court, clay tablet in hand, demanding justice. "Your Honor, I tilled his field for 3 moons, and all I got was this lousy IOU etched on a broken pot. Conversely, if a worker was hired for a specific task and failed to complete it, or worse, abandoned the job halfway through, they could also face penalties, sometimes having to pay back a portion of what they had already received or compensate for damages caused by their unfinished work. This shows a balanced approach protecting both employer and employee. It's like a contractual agreement today where both parties have obligations, but with ancient Sumerian legal consequences. The humor in a dry, bureaucratic way comes from the level of detail they went into for what we consider basic labor laws. It suggests that wage disputes and contract breaches were common enough to warrant extensive legal clarification. It makes you wonder how many Sumerian workers carried miniature copies of the labor code around, with them ready to cite chapter and verse. One quirky tidbit found in later Mesopotamian codes but built on Sumerian economic realities involves specific regulations for what happened if a craftsman ruined the materials entrusted to him. If a tailor ruined wool given to him for weaving, he might have to replace it and pay an additional fine. This extended accountability not just to the labor, but to the proper handling of resources. For you, the Sumerian, it meant that your reputation and your wallet depended on both your skill and your adherence to the terms of your agreement. Historians still argue whether the detailed nature of Sumerian labor laws indicates a highly formalized workforce or simply the meticulous record-keeping tendencies of their scribes. So while working life in ancient Sumer was undoubtedly arduous, the legal system attempted to bring order to the chaos of the labor market. These statutes about wages defaults and worker rights offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly bureaucratic glimpse into a society that understood the importance of fair contracts even for the humblest labor. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, everyone wanted to get paid, and the laws were there to make sure it happened one way or another. From the detailed intricacies of Sumerian labor contracts, let's now turn to a more personal, yet equally legally defined aspect of Sumerian family life, the widow. You might imagine a widow in ancient society as particularly vulnerable, and while challenges certainly existed, the Sumerian laws surprisingly provided specific rights and remarriage rules, aiming to protect her and ensure stability, sometimes with quaintly formal procedures. It's like an ancient version of a prenuptial agreement combined with Social Security, but etched in clay tablets instead of digital files. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian society is that while it was patriarchal, women held more legal rights and agency than in some later ancient civilizations. They could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce in certain circumstances. This extended to widows, who upon their husband's death faced the challenge of maintaining their household and ensuring their children's inheritance. So if you, a Sumerian woman, tragically lost your husband, the law stepped in to define your options and protections. This brings us to the detailed, sometimes amusingly formal, legal protections for Sumerian widows. The laws often ensured that the widow was protected from being exploited or disinherited by her deceased husband's family. For example, her dowry property brought into the marriage would typically be returned to her, or she would receive a share of the marital property to support herself and her children. This was crucial for her economic independence. You can picture the Sumerian widow still grieving, but also firmly clutching her legal tablet, ready to defend her economic rights against any overly eager in-laws. My dowry, good sir, is not up for negotiation. It is quite plainly stated here, Churi. The laws also covered remarriage rules. A widow generally had the right to remarry. However, if she had minor children from her deceased husband, the law might stipulate that she could not sell off their inheritance, idri tobi, fields houses, without the approval of appointed guardians or the court. This ensured that the children's future was secured even if their mother moved on. It's like a very formal, ancient version of child support and inheritance protection, ensuring that the new husband wasn't just marrying for the property. The humor, in a rather dry, legalistic way, comes from the meticulousness with which these personal, emotional situations were codified. It suggests a society that believed every aspect of life, even grief and new beginnings, could and should be regulated to prevent disputes. It makes you wonder how many Sumerian widows had to formally petition the city elders just to get permission to date again, or at least to secure their inheritance before doing so. One quirky tidbit found in later Mesopotamian codes but reflecting earlier Sumerian practice involved a widow who inherited her husband's debts. While the general principle was that she would inherit some liabilities, there were often provisions for limiting her responsibility if the debt was solely his and exceeded their shared assets. This provided a degree of financial safety net for the widow. For you, the Sumerian widow, navigating these precise rules meant balancing your personal grief with the very real demands of legal and financial survival. Historians still argue whether the apparent strength of legal protections for Sumerian women, including widows, was a genuine reflection of their social status or a pragmatic legal response to their economic roles in society. So while the loss of a husband was undoubtedly a tragedy, the Sumerian legal system ensured that a widow had clear rights and a defined path forward, even in remarriage. These statutes about widows' rights and remarriage rules offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly bureaucratic glimpse into a society that strived for order and fairness, even in the most emotional circumstances. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, navigating the complexities of family life often involved a trip to the local scribe for a new legal tablet. From the intricacies of Sumerian widowhood, let's now turn our attention to the very arteries of Sumerian urban life, the Kenite city gates. You might think a city gate is just a gate, a simple entrance and exit. But in ancient Sumer, these bustling hubs were critical for commerce, defense, and public interaction, leading to surprising and sometimes amusing challenges in maintaining the public order. It's like managing a constantly busy airport security line, combined with a street market and a local police precinct, all rolled into one, and everyone has a donkey. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian city-states is that they were typically walled urban centers with gates serving as vital points of control and commerce. These gates were not just fortifications. They were vibrant social spaces where merchants traded, travelers arrived, and legal proclamations were often made. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, wanted to enter or exit your city, you'd pass through a lively, often chaotic hub. This brings us to the humorous challenges of maintaining peace and order at bustling city entrances. Imagine the constant flow of people, animals, and goods. There would be merchants hawking their wares, farmers bringing in produce, soldiers on patrol, and citizens going about their daily business. With so many individuals crammed into a confined space, arguments, minor accidents, and even petty crimes were inevitable. The laws, while not always explicitly detailing gate etiquette, would cover things like obstructing passage, causing a disturbance, or engaging in unauthorized trade. You can picture the beleaguered city guard trying to untangle a traffic jam involving two stubborn donkeys and a loud argument over the price of fish. Please, citizens, keep the barley moving. No brawling by the south gate. The humor comes from the sheer inevitability of chaos in such a confined, busy space. Despite all the meticulous laws about individual behaviors, the sheer volume of human interaction at the gates would have presented a constant challenge to the authorities. It's like trying to enforce quiet hours in a thriving marketplace, a noble but ultimately futile endeavor. One quirky tidbit about Sumerian city gates is that they were often places where important legal and administrative decisions were announced to the public, as they were central gathering points. So you might be standing there waiting for your cousin to arrive with a fresh load of dates, and suddenly a herald appears reading out a new decree about, say, the acceptable size of a potter's kiln. For you, the Sumerian, the city gate was a place of constant activity, full of unexpected news and potentially amusing disruptions. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of specific gate laws in early codes means that most order issues were handled informally by guards, or if such regulations were simply considered part of broader public order statutes. So while the Sumerian city gates were symbols of strength and commerce, they were also perpetual challenges for those tasked with maintaining order. These situations, stemming from the sheer human chaos of a bustling urban center, offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly relatable glimpse into the practicalities of ancient governance. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, trying to keep everyone moving quiet and behaving themselves at the busiest choke points was a constant, often humorous battle for the authorities. And perhaps, just perhaps, every Sumerian guard had a favorite spot for a quick nap away from the endless commotion. From the bustling, sometimes chaotic atmosphere of Sumerian city gates, let's now turn our gaze towards matters of faith, specifically sacrilege priests, and peculiar crimes. Within the religious sphere, you might think offenses against the gods were uniformly met with immediate divine wrath or swift brutal executions. And while severe penalties certainly existed for grave religious transgressions, the Sumerian legal system also contained unusual, sometimes comically specific laws that shed light on their unique approach to what constituted a spiritual misstep. It's like having a very specific set of rules for avoiding divine irritation, where some infractions might earn you eternal damnation, and others a mere side-eye from the local deity. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian religion is its polytheistic nature, with a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses associated with natural forces, cities, and human endeavors. Temples were central to urban life, and priests and priestesses played a crucial role in mediating between humans and the divine. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, engaged in religious practices, you were expected to show proper reverence and adhere to established protocols. This brings us to the unusual, sometimes comically specific laws related to religious transgressions. While major acts of sacrilege like stealing from a temple, which we touched on with theft, carried extremely harsh penalties, there were also more nuanced situations. Imagine a priest who perhaps through negligence or simply a moment of temptation misappropriated a minor offering. Or perhaps someone accidentally damaged a sacred object during a festival, a moment of clumsiness rather than malice. While specific surviving laws are rare for these precise scenarios in Ur-Nammu's code, the broader Mesopotamian legal tradition suggests a system of fines or lesser penalties for less severe infractions that still involve the sacred. You can almost picture the temple scribe meticulously etching a fine onto a clay tablet for inappropriate handling of a ritual libation bowl. Yes, the gods forgive you, but the temple treasury does not. The humor here, in a very dry and bureaucratic way, stems from the attempt to apply earthly legal principles to divine matters. It implies a legal system that tried to quantify even spiritual missteps, bringing them under the purview of civil law. It makes you wonder about the detailed case files on religious accidents and minor breaches of priestly conduct. One quirky tidbit involves the severe penalties for impersonating a priest or trying to pass off fake omens. Such acts undermine the authority of the religious establishment and could be met with harsh punishments, including death. This shows a clear line between genuine mistakes and deliberate attempts to defraud or subvert religious order. For you, the Sumerian citizen, it meant that engaging with the sacred was a serious business, and any funny business could land you in deep trouble not just with the gods but with the law. Historians still argue whether the detailed laws against specific religious misdeeds indicate widespread attempts to defraud the temples or a strong desire by the state to control religious practices for political stability. So while the Sumerian gods were formidable, their earthly representatives often had to deal with the very human failings of their flock, sometimes leading to rather specific legal consequences. These statutes about sacrilege priests and peculiar crimes offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly, bureaucratic glimpse into a society that attempted to legislate even the sacred, ensuring that divine service, like everything else in Sumer, had its own set of rules and corresponding penalties. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, navigating faith required a good lawyer as much as a good prayer. From the surprising legalities of religious infractions, let's now consider an even more subtle, yet equally powerful aspect of Sumerian life: the unwritten laws of daily life. You might assume that a society with so many meticulously etched laws on clay tablets would have everything covered. But just like today, much of ancient Sumerian society was governed by unspoken social rules, customs, and expected behaviors that, if violated, could lead to social censure, minor disputes, and even legal action despite not being explicitly written down. It's like a very formal ancient version of common courtesy combined with social expectations, where a breach might not land you in jail, but it certainly wouldn't win you any popularity contests. A mainstream historical fact about Sumerian culture is the importance of communal living within city-states. People lived in close proximity, relied on each other for various tasks, especially related to irrigation and farming, and engaged in frequent social and economic interactions. This close-knit environment naturally gave rise to a complex web of unwritten expectations and norms. So if you, a Sumerian citizen, wanted to navigate daily life smoothly, You had to understand these subtle social cues and abide by them even if you couldn't find them on a legal code. This brings us to the unspoken social rules and expected behaviors that shaped Sumerian interactions. Imagine a scenario where a neighbor consistently let their children play loudly during the midday nap hour, or habitually borrowed your tools without returning them. While there might not be a specific law for excessive toddler noise or chronic tool borrowing, these actions would certainly cause friction. The lack of a written law wouldn't mean a lack of consequence. Rather, it would escalate into a community dispute, potentially requiring the intervention of elders or eventually a formal complaint in court under a broader nuisance or property damage clause. You can picture the Sumerian neighbor seething silently, then deciding to politely yet firmly bring up the issue. My good sir, your offspring's joyful shrieks are regrettably causing distress to my prize flock of sleepy pigeons. Perhaps a quiet game of dice instead. The humor here comes from the universality of these petty annoyances, regardless of the era. People then, as now, had to deal with inconsiderate neighbors, unreturned favors, and the general friction of close living. The Sumerians, with their love for order, would undoubtedly try to bring even these unwritten rules into a framework of acceptable conduct, even if it meant stretching the interpretation of existing statutes. One quirky tidbit about Sumerian social interaction is the importance of formal greetings and respectful address, particularly towards those of higher status. Breaching these social niceties, while not a criminal offense, could lead to social ostracism or a damaged reputation, which in a close-knit society could be a very real form of punishment. For you, the Sumerian mastering the subtle art of social decorum was just as important as knowing the written laws. Historians still argue whether the apparent formality of Sumerian social interactions, as depicted in literature, reflects actual daily behavior or an idealized societal aspiration. So while the Sumerian scribes tirelessly etched laws onto clay, much of daily life was still a dance of unspoken agreements and expected courtesies. These unwritten laws, though absent from the grand codes, offer a fascinating, sometimes amusingly relatable glimpse into the intricate social fabric of ancient Sumer. It reminds us that even thousands of years ago, navigating the complexities of human relationships often required more than just knowing the rules. It required knowing when to give your neighbor a stern look and when to just let their noisy children be. From the subtle yet powerful realm of unwritten social rules, we arrive at our final reflection on Sumerian law. You've journeyed through a world where every misplaced ox, every tugged beard, every questionable medical procedure, and even every social faux pas had a legal implication, often with a specific fine or an unexpectedly witty consequence. And as we dim the lights on this ancient world, it's clear that the true legacy of laughter and law isn't about mocking their specific rules, but about how these often funny details provide an incredibly humanizing glimpse into Sumerian society. A mainstream historical fact about ancient Sumer is their profound impact on human civilization, not just through their inventions like writing and the wheel, but also their pioneering efforts in establishing comprehensive legal systems. These codes fragmentary, though some may be laid groundwork that influenced later more famous codes like Hammurabi's, and indeed elements of legal thought that persist to this day. You as an observer of this ancient world can see the very early attempts of humanity to bring order to chaos, to define justice, and to resolve disputes in a structured way. But beyond the historical significance, these laws invite a chuckle. The humor doesn't arise from Sumerians being inherently funnier than us, but from the universal human experience reflected in their meticulously detailed statutes. It's the sheer specificity of a fine for biting a lip, or the absurdity of a shepherd having to prove a wolf attack, or the existential dread of a builder whose son's fate depends on a stable mud brick wall. These aren't just dry legal texts. They're snapshots of everyday arguments, petty squabbles, and serious dilemmas that echo across millennia. They remind us that people in 2100 BCE facing a runaway ox probably felt the same exasperation you would today. One quirky tidbit that ties into the overarching theme is how the discovery and decipherment of these cuneiform tablets in the modern era revealed not just grand empires, but these incredibly mundane and often humorous details of daily life and legal disputes. Scholars poring over clay found themselves piecing together these human stories, bringing ancient Sumerians to life as relatable individuals, complete with their own peculiar problems and the laws crafted to solve them. For you, the modern listener, it creates an unexpected bridge to a distant past, proving that laughter, or at least a wry smile, can be found even in ancient legal codes. Historians still argue whether the intent of these specific laws was genuinely pragmatic or if there was an underlying subtle cultural humor in their detailed articulation of consequences for minor infractions. So, as the sounds of the ancient marketplace fade and the dusty images of scribes etching fines onto clay tablets soften, allow yourself to appreciate the sheer human ingenuity and occasional absurdity of the Sumerian legal system. It was a system built for a bustling, complex society designed to cover every possible contingency from the grandest temple theft to the smallest beard-pulling incident. And in its attempt to impose order on every facet of life, it inadvertently created a captivating and often laugh-out-loud record of what it meant to be human at the very dawn of civilization. As the sun sets on ancient Sumer and its meticulously etched laws gently fade from your mind, feel the quiet settling in around you. The disputes over oxen, the arguments at city gates, the specific fines for every mishap. They all recede, now becoming faint echoes from a world long past. There are no more ancient laws to interpret, no more bearded men to worry about. Just the soft hum of your fan, perhaps, or the gentle rustle of leaves outside. Let the quiet rhythm of your breath deepen, becoming a slow, steady tide that carries you towards tranquility. Allow your muscles to relax, releasing any lingering thoughts of Sumerian legal predicaments. The meticulous scribes have finished their work. Now it is your turn to simply be. Drift effortlessly into the comforting embrace of a deep, peaceful sleep. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams.